The sound wasn't thunder. Thunder doesn't scream like tearing aluminum before it dies in the freezing tide. Gwen Miller dragged him from 3 feet of surf, his lungs rattling with jet fuel and his dark suit slick with blood. She saved a life, and didn't care who it belonged to. But by 7 the next morning, 5 matte black SUVs cut through the sea mist on her dirt road, blocking her driveway. The men inside didn't come to say thank you. The bay didn't keep secrets for long, but it took its time swallowing what didn't belong. It was 2 in the morning when the sky cracked open. Not with lightning, but with the high-pitched whine of a twin-engine turboprop fighting a losing war against gravity. Gwen Miller was at her workbench, repacking the grease bearings on a 1984 outboard motor when the engine scream cut out. A second later came the sound, a dull, concussive thud crunch that rattled the glass in her workshop window and sent a flock of roosting gulls screaming into the dark. She didn't freeze. She didn't call the county sheriff either. Out here on the sharp, jagged edge of the northern coast, the sheriff was 40 minutes away on a dry night, and tonight the rain was coming down in grey, wind-whipped sheets. Gwen wiped her black-greased hands on a rag, kicked off her work shoes, and stepped into her knee-high rubber boots. She grabbed her heavy oiled canvas coat, a yellow high-lumens flashlight, a pair of heavy wire cutters, and a 40-foot coil of braided nylon rope. The air outside smelled of salt, wet pine, and the unmistakable sharp stench of raw kerosene. Jet fuel. She walked down the slick wood of her personal boat ramp, the cold rain stinging her cheeks like thrown gravel. 50 yards out into the shallow, ice-black water of the inlet, something jagged stuck out of the tide. The tail section of a private aircraft rested at a grotesque 45-degree angle. The cabin was already half submerged, resting on the mud bank where the tide dropped out. "Idiots," she muttered, her breath pluming in the dark. She pushed off in her 12-foot aluminum skiff, yanked the pull cord on the small 4-horsepower engine, and let the small boat buzz through the chop. When she reached the wreckage, the sound of water gurgling into metal compartments was deafening. The plane was dying. Fuel was spreading across the surface of the inlet, a shimmering rainbow sheen that smelled like a gas station fire waiting to happen. Gwen shined her light through the shattered cockpit glass. The pilot was folded over the yoke, unnatural and still. She squeezed her light further down the cabin aisle. Near the door, half pinned beneath a collapsed luggage rack, a man was moving. He wasn't screaming. That was the first thing she noticed. Most people dying in dark, freezing water made noise. They panicked. They thrashed. This man was completely silent, his large frame wedged tight against the leather upholstery, his right arm working with methodical, brutal effort to wedge himself free from the crushed aluminum frame. Gwen stepped from her skiff onto the submerged wing, her rubber boots slipping on the slick metal. She pulled her wire cutters and utility knife from her coat pocket. "Don't light a match," she said, her voice dry and flat, as she kicked through the broken side emergency door. The man stopped moving. In the harsh beam of her flashlight, his face was a mask of pale skin, dark stubble, and fresh crimson blood running down from a deep split along his hairline. His eyes were grey, cold, sharp, and entirely unbothered by the fact that he was 5 minutes away from drowning in 8-degree salt water. "The belt!" he rasped. His voice sounded like dry gravel dragged over iron. "It's jammed." Gwen leaned down. The smell of high-dollar cologne mixed sickeningly with aviation fuel and copper. She took her utility knife, wedged the thick blade under the taut nylon strap across his chest, and yanked upward with everything she had. The strap snapped. "Can you stand?" she asked. "My leg is caught," he said. No panic, just a statement of fact. She shone the light down. His left leather boot was trapped under a buckled steel support strut. Water was up to his chest now. The bay was filling the cabin inch by inch. Gwen grabbed the steel pry bar she'd jammed into her belt loop before leaving the workshop. She wedged it under the buckled strut, braced her weight against the back of his chair, and heaved. Her muscles burned. Her breath hitched in her throat. The metal groaned, yielded 3 inches, and the man hauled his leg free with a ragged intake of air. "Up!" she barked. "Now!" He was heavy. Dense muscle, soaked wool, expensive leather, and 6'3" of dead weight. He leaned on her heavily as she dragged him toward the open hatch, his arm locked over her shoulder like an iron beam. She felt the wet heat of his blood soaking into the shoulder of her canvas coat. They fell together into the aluminum skiff. The small boat rocked violently, taking on 3 inches of salt spray before settling. Gwen didn't look back at the plane. She yanked the motor cord, flipped the tiller, and slammed the throttle forward, steering them back toward the warm, dim light of her workshop. Behind them, with a heavy, sucking groan, the remaining air flushed out of the fuselage. The plane settled fully beneath the black water, leaving only a slick of fuel and floating debris. Gwen dragged him up her boat ramp. It took 10 minutes of pure physical torture, her calves screaming under the load. She hauled him through the side door of her small house attached to the shop, dumping him onto the ancient leather sofa near her cast-iron wood stove. He lay there, his chest heaving, blood leaking onto her worn cushions. Gwen didn't waste time with soft questions. She knelt, unlacing his soaked, high-end Italian dress shoes and pulling them off. Next came his dark jacket. As she peeled the heavy, wet wool from his shoulder, something heavy and black slid from an shoulder holster and clattered onto the hardwood floor. A custom Sig Sauer 9mm handgun. Matte finish. No serial numbers visible on the slide. Gwen looked at the gun. Then she looked at his face. His eyes were open, tracking her every movement. He didn't reach for the weapon. He just watched her. His breathing shallow, his jaw set hard against the pain in his leg and head. Gwen picked up the pistol by the grip. She pressed the magazine release, slid the heavy magazine out, pulled the slide back to eject the live round from the chamber, and tossed the cleared weapon into a metal tool bucket 5 feet away. "You're not going to shoot me for dragging you out of the bay," she said, grabbing a clean towel and a box of gauze from her first aid kit. The man's pale lips twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. It was too cold for a smile. "Smart girl," he grunted, his voice barely a whisper. "Gwen," she said, pressing a pad of folded gauze hard against the gash on his forehead. "My name is Gwen, and you're bleeding on my couch." "Roman," he said softly, his eyes fluttering slightly as the shock began to take its toll. "My name is Roman." He went limp a second later, knocked out cold by the concussion and the sudden burst of warmth from the stove. Gwen stood over him for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. She looked at his hands, calloused, long-fingered, with a thin silver band on his right pinky and faint scars across the knuckles. This wasn't a businessman. This wasn't a pilot. Gwen went back to her kitchen, poured a cup of cold, leftover coffee, and sat in the wooden rocking chair opposite the sofa. She picked up her heavy iron wrench, rested it across her knees, and waited for dawn. The sun didn't rise so much as it bled through the grey fog at 6:30. The rain had stopped, replaced by a dense, suffocating sea mist that hung low over the spruce trees and turned the gravel road leading to Gwen's property into a tunnel of white. Gwen hadn't slept a wink. She had spent the last 4 hours stoking the wood stove, watching Roman's chest rise and fall, and clean stitching his forehead with a curved suture needle and 10-pound monofilament fishing line she kept in her kit. He hadn't flinched once while she worked on his skin, even unconscious. His body was built like a vault, hard, quiet, and full of old damage. She'd found 2 faded bullet scars on his ribs when she'd checked for internal bleeding. At 7 o'clock, the silence was broken. It started as a low, mechanical hum in the earth, a deep, rhythmic vibration that vibrated through the floorboards of her cabin. It wasn't the sound of a local pickup or a delivery truck. This was the steady, synchronized rumble of heavy V8 engines operating in low gear. Gwen stood up, setting her empty mug on the side table. She walked to the small front window and peeled back the faded green curtain. Down the narrow half-mile dirt driveway, 5 identical matte black Chevrolet Suburbans were emerging from the mist. They drove slowly, like a funeral procession, their dark tinted windows reflecting nothing. They didn't bounce on the rutted, muddy track. Their heavy, reinforced suspensions absorbed every bump with heavy, metallic efficiency. They rolled onto her gravel yard, surrounding her house in a tight, tactical semicircle. "Shit," Gwen breathed. Behind her, a shift in the room caught her ear. Roman was sitting up. He didn't groan. He didn't stretch. He simply swung his bare feet off the sofa and rested his elbows on his knees, his eyes clear and entirely devoid of sleep. He was holding his cracked ribs with one large hand, his face pale under the dark stubble, but his posture was as relaxed as a man sitting in his own living room. He looked toward the window, then at Gwen. "They're early," he said softly. "Who are they?" Gwen asked, her hand drifting toward the iron pry bar resting against the doorframe. "Police?" Roman gave a short, dry breath that might have been a laugh if it carried any humor. "No, police ask questions. My men just take care of things. Your men. And my enemies," Roman added, his grey eyes locking onto hers with a quiet, dangerous weight. Depending on who drove down the lane first. Outside, heavy doors slammed in near unison. Thump, 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 thump. Gwen stepped to the door, looking through the glass insert. 8 men had stepped out into the damp sea air. They wore tailored black raincoats over dark suits. None of them looked like local boys. They moved with the sharp, calculated spatial awareness of men who lived their lives expecting a bullet from every blind corner. 2 of them stood by the front bumpers with their hands tucked inside their coats. 3 others moved around the perimeter of her workshop, checking the line of sight toward the trees. The lead man walked up her 3 wooden porch steps. He was broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with a thick beard trimmed neatly around a jawline that looked like it had taken its share of hits. He wore a silver signet ring on his right hand, the same design as the ring on Roman's pinky. He didn't knock. He stood on the porch, staring directly through the glass at Gwen. Gwen grabbed her pry bar, unlocked the deadbolt with a loud, deliberate click, and pulled the heavy oak door open 6 inches. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice dropping into the low, steady register she used when dealing with drunk fishermen at the fuel dock. "Get off my porch." The man with the beard didn't blink. He looked at her hands on the iron bar, then looked past her shoulder into the dark hallway. "Miss Miller," the man said. His voice was smooth, cultured, but carried the flat undertone of a man who didn't take orders from anyone without a higher body count. "We are looking for a passenger from a lost aircraft. We tracked the emergency beacon to this inlet." "There's no aircraft here," Gwen lied smoothly. "Just rocks and salt water." "Tomas!" a voice called out from behind her. Roman stepped out into the dark hallway, leaning heavily against the wooden paneling to keep his weight off his bad leg. He had put his wet linen shirt back on, though it was unbuttoned at the neck, revealing the white bandage Gwen had taped over his collarbone. The moment the man on the porch, Tomas, saw Roman, his entire posture transformed. The cold arrogance drained from his face, replaced by a sudden, rigid discipline that was almost terrifying. He snapped his hands out of his coat pockets, lowered his head 3 inches, and stepped back 2 steps off the porch. "Boss," Thomas said, his voice dropping an octave. "We thought the radar cut out over the ridge." "We thought you were in the deep channel." "I was," Roman said, stepping past Gwen as if she weren't holding a 2-foot piece of iron between them. He stood in the open doorway, the grey morning light hitting his bruised, stitched face. "Miss Miller pulled me out of the cockpit before the cabin filled." Tomas looked at Gwen again. This time, there was no condescension in his eyes. there was something far more dangerous. Evaluation. He was looking at her the way an engineer looks at a load-bearing beam, calculating how much weight she could take before she snapped. "The pilot?" Tomas asked softly. "Dead," Roman replied. "Sabotage. The starboard fuel line was cut with a thermite charge. It blew 3 minutes after we cleared the runway at Bangor." A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the porch. The 4 men standing in the gravel yard shifted their weight slightly, their eyes scanning the fog-drenched pine trees around the house. "Who?" Tomas asked. "We'll talk about who when we get back to the city," Roman said. He turned his head slowly to look at Gwen. She was standing 3 feet away, her iron bar still gripped firmly in her right hand, her chin tilted up. She didn't look scared. She looked pissed off. She had mud on her jeans, fish scales on her boots, and a guest who had brought 5 truckloads of heavily armed men into her driveway before breakfast. "You owe me $300, Gwen said, her voice cutting through the heavy tension like a rusty knife. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" $300, Gwen repeated, looking Roman straight in the eye. "For the ruined upholstery on my sofa, the suture line from my tackle box, and the gas I burned in my boat getting you out of the bay. Pay up and get off my dirt." Thomas reached instinctively into his coat, likely for a money clip, but Roman held up a single hand. "Put it away, Tomas," Roman commanded quietly. Roman leaned against the doorframe, his dark grey eyes locked onto Gwen. For the first time, a small, genuine spark of interest lit up his face. "A ruined couch," Roman murmured. "Is that all my life is worth to you, Miss Miller?" "Right now," Gwen said, stepping closer to him until she could smell the iron and pine on his breath. "Right now, your life is worth about 5 minutes of peace and quiet. Take your friends and leave." Roman didn't move. He stood there in the damp morning chill, letting the silence stretch until even the wind in the needles of the pine trees seemed to stop. "I don't leave debts unpaid," Roman said softly. "It's bad for business, and it's lethal in my line of work." "I'm not asking for a favor," Gwen said. "I'm asking you to leave." "You don't understand the situation, Gwen," Roman said, using her first name, with a slow, deliberate cadence that felt like a weight dropping onto her shoulders. "My plane didn't fall out of the sky because of bad weather. It was dropped by men who spent 6 months planning how to put me 10 fathoms under the ocean. They have scouts along this coast. By noon, they will know the wreck is in this bay. By 2 o'clock, they will know someone dragged a body out of the water." Gwen felt a faint, cold prickle at the back of her neck, but she didn't let her jaw drop. "I live alone. I don't talk to people. They won't ask you questions," Tomas interrupted from the steps, his voice cold and matter-of-fact. "They'll burn this house to the ground with you inside it, just to clear the record. That's how the Vane family operates." Gwen looked at Thomas, then back at Roman. The name Vane didn't mean anything to her, but the look in Roman's eyes did. He wasn't exaggerating to scare her. He was stating an undeniable truth about the world he lived in, a world she had accidentally dragged into her front yard when she pulled his seat harness free. "So what are you saying?" Gwen asked, her grip tightening on the iron bar. "I'm supposed to just abandon my home because you have enemies?" "I'm saying you have 2 choices," Roman said. He took a single step closer to her, his large frame towering over her, though his expression remained unreadable. "Choice 1. I leave you $10,000 in cash, my men secure the perimeter for 6 hours, and you take your truck and run as far west as your gas tank will take you. You change your name, you start over. And choice 2? Choice 2, Roman said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly steady rhythm. You come with me. My house in the city is fortified. My doctors will check your injuries." "I don't have injuries," she snapped. "And my men will protect you, until I find the people who put that thermite on my wing and eliminate them. Once the threat is gone, you come back here. I rebuild your dock, I fix your house, and I pay you enough money that you'll never have to turn a wrench again, unless you want to." Gwen stared at him. A dry, bitter laugh escaped her throat. "You're crazy," she said. "I'm not going anywhere with you. I don't know you. You're a criminal." "I am," Roman agreed without a second of hesitation. "I am a very violent, very wealthy criminal. But I am the only criminal currently standing on your porch who feels obligated to keep you breathing. The men coming down this road in 2 hours won't have that sense of professional courtesy." He turned to Thomas. "Check the road. Have the second unit put 2 vehicles across the county bridge. If any unfamiliar plates show up, drop them." "Yes, boss," Thomas said, turning on his heel and barking orders into a small radio clipped to his collar. Gwen looked past the porch. The 4 men in the yard were already moving with cold, military precision. 2 of them were unearthing long, hard-shelled plastic cases from the trunk of the rear SUV. Automatic rifles. Her quiet life, her small repair shop, her quiet nights by the wood stove, the scent of sea salt and engine grease was evaporating right in front of her eyes, burned away by the diesel exhaust of 5 black trucks. She looked down at her hands. The grease was still under her fingernails. Her knuckles were rough, scarred from 10 years of hard physical labor on these docks. She had built this life out of scrap metal and sheer stubbornness after her father died. She had never asked anyone for help, and she had never run away from a fight. "If I leave," Gwen said, her voice dangerously quiet, "what happens to my shop?" Roman looked back at the small, weathered garage, the rusty tools hanging on the outer wall, the small aluminum skiff tied to the dock. "They'll burn it," Roman said honestly. "To leave a message." Gwen felt a knot of cold, hard rage twist in her gut. Not fear. Rage. She looked up at Roman's face, at the dark blood still caked around her precise stitches, at the sharp, unyielding line of his mouth. "If they touch my shop," Gwen said, pointing a finger directly at his chest, "I don't care how many guns your men have. I will come back and finish what that salt water started." A slow, genuine smile spread across Roman's face this time. Dangerous, sharp, and terrifyingly real. "Fair enough, Miss Miller," he said, stepping off the porch toward the center suburban, as a guard opened the heavy armored door for him. "Grab your coat. We have a war to settle." The door of the suburban closed with a sound like a bank vault sealing shut. Inside, the silence was absolute. The heavy armored glass stripped the roar of the ocean and the whistling wind away, leaving only the low, electronic hum of the climate control. Gwen sat stiffly against the black leather. She had brought exactly 2 things with her: a duffel bag containing 3 changes of clothes, and the heavy iron pry bar, which she rested across her knees. Roman sat beside her. He hadn't spoken since they pulled out of the driveway. He was staring out the window, watching the jagged coastline disappear into the morning fog. His face was washed out, the skin stretched tight over his cheekbones. The adrenaline from the crash was burning off, leaving only the crushing reality of fractured ribs, a shredded leg, and a concussion. "You're bleeding again," Gwen said. She didn't whisper. The space was too quiet for whispering. Roman looked down at his chest. The white bandage showing through his unbuttoned collar was turning a slow, muddy crimson. "Tomas," Roman said, his voice barely louder than the hum of the tires. From the front seat, on the other side of the thick plexiglass partition, the bearded man picked up a handset. "Boss, tell Dr. Orris to meet us in the south garage. Have him bring a portable X-ray and 4 units of O-negative." Roman didn't wait for a reply. He dropped his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes. "You're an idiot," Gwen said, looking at the fresh blood. Roman opened one grey eye. "Excuse me?" "You're bleeding because you're sitting rigidly straight. Your muscles are tensed. You're pushing the blood out of the wound just to prove to your men in the front seat that you aren't dying." She reached over, grabbed his shoulder, and shoved him back against the recline of the leather seat. "Lie back. Breathe from your stomach, not your chest. I didn't spend 3 hours dragging your heavy ass out of a sinking plane just to watch you bleed out on Italian leather." For a second, the air in the cabin turned dangerous. The men driving these trucks killed people for breathing the wrong way around this man. But Roman just stared at her hand on his shoulder. Then, slowly, the tension bled out of his jaw. He let his weight sink back into the seat. "I don't like showing weakness," Roman said, his eyes drifting to the ceiling. "It invites problems." "You were trapped under 1,000 pounds of aluminum drowning in salt water," Gwen replied flatly. "You're past the point of looking tough. The drive took 3 hours. The transition from the untamed coast to the city was jarring. Tall pines gave way to concrete overpasses, and the smell of salt was replaced by the acrid scent of diesel and hot asphalt. They didn't go to the financial district, and they didn't go to the wealthy suburbs. The convoy pulled into an industrial sector dominated by old brick warehouses and high steel fences. They approached a massive building that looked like an abandoned meatpacking plant. The heavy corrugated steel doors slid open electronically, and the 5 SUVs rolled into darkness. When the doors shut behind them, industrial halogens snapped on, flooding a vast underground parking structure with harsh white light. There were at least 30 men waiting. They weren't wearing the sharp suits of Tomas's detail. These men wore heavy work boots, dark denim, and tactical vests. The moment Roman's truck stopped, the doors were pulled open. A thin, balding man in a crisp white shirt, holding a black medical bag, hurried forward. "Dr. Ares, boss," the doctor said, his eyes scanning Roman's battered frame. "Let's get you upstairs." "Fix me here," Roman grunted. Refusing the wheelchair 2 men tried to push toward him. He gripped the doorframe of the SUV and hauled himself upright. "I have a meeting in 20 minutes. Patch the ribs. Stitch the collarbone properly. No narcotics." "Sir, your leg—" "No narcotics," Roman repeated. The temperature in the garage seemed to drop 10 degrees. Gwen stepped out of the truck on the other side. She slung her duffel bag over her shoulder and gripped her pry bar. The men in the garage stopped and stared at her. She didn't look like she belonged. She had grease on her jeans, dried blood on her heavy canvas coat, and a scowl that dared any of them to speak to her. Thomas walked around the hood of the car. He looked at the iron bar in her hand. "You won't need that here, Miss Miller," Tomas said. "You're safe." "I was safe this morning," Gwen shot back. "Where do I go?" Thomas pointed to a heavy steel freight elevator at the far end of the garage. "The 4th floor. It's the residential wing. No one goes up there without my or Mr. Roman's explicit permission. There is food, there is a shower. Wait there." Gwen didn't wait to be escorted. She walked past the heavily armed guards, ignoring their stares, and hit the call button for the elevator. As the metal doors grated open, she glanced back. Roman was sitting on the tailgate of the SUV, his shirt stripped off under the harsh halogens. His torso was a map of old violence, burns, knife scars, and the 2 bullet wounds she had felt earlier. Dr. Aris was injecting a local anesthetic into his collarbone. Roman didn't flinch. He was looking straight across the garage, right at Gwen. She held his gaze for a second, then stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, sealing the violence away. The 4th floor wasn't a warehouse. It was a fortress wrapped in luxury. The floors were polished dark wood, the walls lined with sound-dampening acoustic panels. The windows were small, narrow, and made of glass so thick it distorted the city skyline outside. The air smelled of clean linen and expensive cedar. Gwen found a guest room at the end of the hall. It was bigger than her entire house on the coast. She didn't touch the massive plush bed. She walked into the slate-tiled bathroom, stripped off her blood-soaked coat and grease-stained clothes, and stood under the scalding hot shower until her skin turned pink. She scrubbed the salt and the smell of aviation fuel out of her hair. but she couldn't wash away the lingering adrenaline. When she stepped out, she dressed in clean jeans, a heavy grey wool sweater, and her boots. She didn't sit down. She paced. 2 hours passed. No one came to check on her. Gwen was not a woman who waited well. Her whole life had been built on fixing things the moment they broke. This forced isolation grated on her nerves like a dull file on sheet metal. She grabbed her pry bar from the bathroom sink, walked out of her room, and headed for the heavy oak double doors at the center of the floor. They were unlocked. She pushed them open. The room beyond was a massive, open-plan office. A wall of monitors displayed live feeds of the city's shipping ports. Cranes moving containers, trucks lined up at checkpoints, dark water reflecting the city lights. A long mahogany table dominated the center of the room. Roman sat at the head of it. He was wearing a fresh black shirt, though his left arm was heavily taped and strapped to his chest. Thomas stood to his right. 5 other men sat around the table, their faces grim, their voices hushed but volatile. No one noticed Gwen step into the shadows by the door. They hit the south terminal an hour after the plane went down, a man with a scarred jaw was saying. He pointed to a map spread across the wood. The Vane family sent 3 crews. They burned out the customs office and shot 2 of our dock masters. They think you're dead, Roman. They're making a play for the deep water ports. Let them take the south terminal, Roman said, his voice a low, terrifying rasp. The men around the table exchanged nervous glances. Boss, the scarred man hesitated. If we give up the south terminal, they control the supply line into the warehouse district. We'll bleed cash. Let them take it, Roman repeated, leaning forward. The movement clearly cost him in pain, but his face remained a mask of stone. Sullivan Vane thinks like a brute. He wants territory. He wants to plant his flag. If we fight him at the terminal, it becomes a war of attrition. We lose men. We lose time. Roman pointed a long, calloused finger at the map. Pull everyone back to the rail yard. Leave the terminal completely empty. Sullivan will think we're panicking. He'll move his heavy hitters in to secure it tonight. When they are all inside, you lock the perimeter gates and drop the thermite charges on the storage tanks. Silence fell over the room. It was absolute and suffocating. You want to burn our own terminal to the ground? Thomas asked, his voice deadpan. I want to burn Sullivan Vane's best men to the ground, Roman corrected, his grey eyes flashing with a cold, mechanical fury. Insurance will cover the concrete. Nothing covers a sudden lack of soldiers. By tomorrow morning, Sullivan won't have a crew to hold his own streets, let alone mine. Gwen felt a chill run down her spine. The casualness with which he ordered the destruction of a city block, the calculation of human life against concrete and steel. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a tactician. He played with human lives the way she played with torque and leverage on a broken engine block. She shifted her weight, and her heavy boot creaked on the floorboard. 6 guns cleared leather in a fraction of a second. Every man at the table, except Roman, had a weapon pointed at the shadows by the door. Gwen froze, her knuckles white around her iron bar. Stand down, Roman commanded. He didn't even look up from the map. Put the guns away. The men hesitated, looking at Thomas, who nodded once. The guns vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Roman finally looked up, his gaze finding Gwen in the dim light. You don't follow instructions well, do you, Gwen? He asked. I get claustrophobic, she said, stepping fully into the light. She ignored the 5 killers staring at her, and walked straight to the table. She looked at the map, at the red markers indicating the shipping lanes and the ports. You're a long way from the coast, the scarred man muttered, looking her up and down with clear disdain. Gwen didn't look at him. She looked at Roman. You're going to trap them in the south terminal? That's the plan, Roman said, watching her carefully. It's a bad plan, Gwen said. The air left the room. Thomas took a half-step forward, his jaw tight. Miss Miller, you need to go back to your room. Why is it a bad plan? Roman asked, raising a hand to stop Thomas. He was leaning back in his chair now, his head tilted, studying her with that same intense, terrifying evaluation he had given her on the porch. Gwen pointed the tip of her iron bar at the map. I used to run salvage out of the South Harbour before I moved up the coast. The South Terminal was built on a tidal marsh. The foundations are old. You lock the gates. Fine. But the drainage tunnels that run under the primary container yards dump straight into the old canal. If these guys are half as smart as they think they are, they won't use the gates to get out when the fire starts. They'll drop the grate in Warehouse 4 and walk out under the street. You'll burn your own terminal, and they'll be sitting on a boat half a mile away laughing at you. The scarred man scowled. There are no tunnels on the blueprints. The blueprints were drawn up by city planners who never worked a day in the mud, Gwen snapped. The smugglers built those tunnels in the 70s. Every dock rat knows about them. If your enemies are taking the port, they have dock rats on their payroll. Roman stared at the map. Then he looked at Thomas. Take a crew, Roman said softly. Weld the grates shut in Warehouse 4. Put 20 pounds of C4 on the canal exit. Thomas nodded, his eyes lingering on Gwen with a new, quiet respect. Done. Roman looked back at Gwen. The room was empty of the other men in seconds, leaving just the two of them in the dim light of the surveillance monitors. You're not just a mechanic, are you? Roman asked. I fix things, Gwen said, turning to leave. Try not to break anything else while I'm stuck here. Midnight came with the smell of rain. Gwen sat by the narrow window in her room, watching the storm roll in over the city. It wasn't like those storms on the coast. Here, the rain just turned the streets slick and black, reflecting the ugly orange glow of sodium streetlights. There was no wind whistling through the pines, just the dull, heavy roar of distant traffic. She was drinking black tea from a porcelain cup, wishing it was cheap coffee in a stained mug. A knock sounded at her door. It wasn't the heavy, authoritative rap of Thomas. It was quiet, deliberate. It's unlocked, she said. The door opened, and Roman stepped inside. He was moving better, though he still favoured his injured leg. He carried a heavy glass tumbler with 2 fingers of amber liquid in it. He walked to the opposite side of the window, leaning against the wall, staring out at the rain. I hate the city in the rain, Roman said softly. It smells like wet garbage and exhaust. The coast smells clean, like it's washing the world out. Then why do you live here? Gwen asked, not looking at him. Because power doesn't live on the coast, Roman replied, taking a slow sip of his drink. And without power, you are at the mercy of people who have it. I learned a long time ago, Gwen. You either hold the leash, or you wear the collar. And the Vane family? Sullivan Vane wants the leash, Roman said. He looked at his glass, watching the amber liquid catch the dim light. He inherited his empire. I built mine. I started on the docks, unloading crates of stolen electronics for men who treated me like dirt. I fought for every inch of concrete I own. He looked at her, his eyes stripping away the tough, cynical exterior she wore like armor. You understand that? You built your life the same way, hand by hand, blister by blister. Don't compare us, Gwen said, her voice hard. I fix engines. I don't set fire to city blocks. No, Roman agreed quietly. You just drag drowning men out of the ocean and stand in front of armed killers with a piece of scrap metal. We aren't so different, Gwen. You just prefer a smaller casualty count. Before Gwen could respond, a heavy, concussive thud rattled the thick glass of the window. It wasn't thunder. Gwen felt the vibration in her boots. Roman stiffened, his head snapping toward the city skyline. 3 miles to the south, a massive column of orange flame erupted into the night sky, tearing through the rain and illuminating the low-hanging clouds. The South Terminal. Roman's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, pressed it to his ear, and listened for 5 seconds. Did they get into the tunnels? Roman asked. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. He listened for another moment. Good. Tell the fire department they can move in. Let the police find the bodies. Lock down the perimeter. He hung up the phone and looked back out the window at the burning skyline. It's done, Roman said. How many? Gwen asked, her voice tight. 30 men, Roman said, turning to face her. 30 men who came to take my life and everything I built. They burned in the mud. Gwen stared at the fire in the distance. She thought she would feel sick. She thought she would feel horror. But as she looked at Roman, at the man whose life she had saved just 24 hours ago, she only felt a terrifying, electric clarity. She was no longer an observer. By speaking up in the boardroom, by drawing the map to the tunnels, she had handed him the match. She had crossed a line in the sand, and the tide was never going to wash it away. Sullivan Vane will know it was a trap, Gwen said, her voice steady, despite the hammer beating in her chest. Yes, he will, Roman said, stepping away from the wall. He moved closer to her, stopping just a foot away. He smelled of gun oil, scotch, and cold rain. He'll know I'm alive, and by tomorrow morning, he will know you are here with me. His people will dig into your life. They will find your shop. They will find out exactly who pulled me out of that plane. Gwen looked up at him. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back. Are you trying to scare me? She asked. I'm trying to prepare you, Roman said softly, his hand reaching out. He didn't touch her, but his fingers hovered inches from her face, a gesture of strange, restrained intimacy. The coast is gone, Gwen. The quiet is gone. You are in my world now, and I need to know if you're going to break. Gwen looked at his hand, then up into his cold, grey eyes. She thought of the heavy iron pry bar sitting on her bedside table. I don't break, Gwen whispered. I break things. A dark, genuine smile touched Roman's lips. He finally closed the distance, his rough thumb brushing lightly against her jawline. Good, Roman said, because tomorrow we are going to war. The morning did not bring sunlight. It brought a pale, sickly grey that pressed flat against the reinforced glass of the penthouse. Gwen found Roman in the main living area at 6 a.m. He was sitting at a massive glass dining table, an array of satellite maps and printed manifests spread out over the surface. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the intricate faded ink that wrapped around his right forearm. He held a pen, crossing out names on a ledger with methodical, chilling precision. Thomas stood in the corner, a phone pressed tight to his ear. The bearded man looked up as Gwen walked in. His expression was a stone wall, but his eyes flickered with a sudden, dark pity. Gwen stopped. She knew that look. It was the look the harbour master gave her when her father's boat was towed back into port, completely empty 10 years ago. What happened? Gwen asked. Thomas lowered the phone. He looked at Roman. Roman stopped writing. He set the pen down slowly, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the ledger. Sullivan Vane is bleeding, Roman said, his voice flat. We took his men, his port, and his pride. Men like Sullivan don't retreat when they bleed. They lash out. At what? Gwen demanded, her heart starting a slow, heavy thud against her ribs. Roman picked up a tablet from the table, tapped the screen once, and slid it across the glass toward her. Gwen walked over and looked down. It was a drone photograph, taken maybe an hour ago in the early dawn light. The image showed a patch of jagged, rocky coastline. The water was black and churning. Where her house used to be, there was only a smoking, blackened crater of ash and charred timber. The corrugated metal roof of her workshop had collapsed inward, warped by massive heat. The wooden boat ramp was scorched to the waterline. Her 1984 outboard motor, her father's heavy iron vise, the ancient leather sofa where she had stitched a mobster's head together, gone, reduced to white ash and twisted nails. They hit it at 4 in the morning, Thomas said quietly from the corner. Incendiary grenades. If you had been in your bed, Miss Miller, you wouldn't have even woken up. The heat would have pulled the oxygen out of your lungs before the fire reached the mattress. Gwen stared at the screen. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She felt a cold, absolute silence expand inside her chest, a vacuum that sucked all the air out of the room. She reached out and touched the smooth glass of the tablet, right over the black smear that used to be her front porch. "I told you they would leave a message," Roman said softly. He didn't offer empty condolences. He didn't apologize. He knew grief, and he knew that an apology right now would only insult her. "Where is he?" Gwen asked. Her voice didn't sound like her own. It sounded like metal grinding on metal. "Sullivan has a stronghold in the industrial flats," Roman said, tapping a red circle on the physical map in front of him. "An old ship-breaking yard, hundreds of rusted hulls, cargo containers and scrap metal. It's a maze. He has 50 men dug in with high-caliber rifles. We are gearing up now. We hit him at noon." Gwen looked up from the tablet. "I'm going with you." Thomas shook his head immediately. "Absolutely not. Miss Miller, with respect, this isn't a bar fight. This is an organized assault on a fortified position. You will get yourself killed, or worse, you will get one of my men killed trying to cover you." "I know the flats," Gwen said, ignoring Tomas completely and locking eyes with Roman. "I used to buy salvage from the breakers down there. The yard is built on a grid, but the old drainage locks flood when the tide comes in. Sullivan's men will be watching the main gates and the rail spurs. They won't be watching the subterranean storm runoff that feeds the dry docks. I know how to manually crank the sluice gates. I can get you inside the perimeter without triggering a single alarm." Tomas frowned, looking at the map. "The storm runoff is capped." "It's capped with hydraulic locks," Gwen corrected, her tone sharp and venomous. "Hydraulics run on pressure lines. You cut the pressure line at the junction box, the gate drops under its own weight. I can do it in 2 minutes with a pair of bolt cutters." Silence stretched across the room. Thomas looked at Roman, waiting for the final word. Roman studied her face. He saw the grease still ground deep into her cuticles. He saw the raw, unpolished fury radiating from her posture. She was a woman who had just had her entire world burned to the ground for the crime of pulling a dying man out of the sea. "Give her a vest," Roman ordered, standing up. He grabbed his dark wool coat from the back of the chair. "And find her a pair of bolt cutters." The ship-breaking yard smelled of dead oceans and iron oxide. The rain had returned, a relentless, driving downpour that turned the dirt pathways of the yard into a slurry of thick, toxic mud. Towering on either side of them were the gutted, rusted carcasses of decommissioned freighters, their steel ribs jutting into the grey sky like the bones of prehistoric leviathans. Gwen moved through the mud in a heavy Kevlar vest pulled tight over her canvas coat. The weight of it was suffocating, pressing down on her collarbones, but she didn't complain. She carried a massive pair of steel-handled bolt cutters. Roman and Thomas flanked her, moving with terrifying silence. Behind them, 12 men in dark tactical gear fanned out through the rain, their suppressed rifles raised and tracking every rusted shadow. "The junction box is 50 yards ahead," Gwen whispered, pointing toward a concrete bunker half buried in the mud near a massive dry dock. "2 guards on the roof," Tomas murmured, staring through the scope of his rifle. "Pacing." Roman nodded. He didn't speak. He just raised 2 fingers. 2 hollow, muffled thwips cut through the sound of the rain. 50 yards away, the 2 guards dropped out of sight, collapsing onto the concrete roof without a sound. "Move," Roman said. Gwen scrambled down the muddy embankment, slipping once before Roman's heavy hand caught her by the belt, hauling her upright with effortless strength. They reached the concrete bunker. The heavy steel door was locked with a thick, hardened padlock. Gwen didn't hesitate. She stepped up, hooked the jaws of her bolt cutters around the shackle of the lock, braced one handle against her hip, and threw her entire body weight into the other. The steel groaned, resisted, and then cracked with a sharp snap. She yanked the door open. Inside, a maze of rusted pipes and heavy hydraulic lines fed into a massive winch system. "Which one?" Roman asked, his gun trained on the catwalk above them. "The primary return line. Give me 30 seconds, Gwen said. She grabbed a heavy wrench from the control desk, found the thickest rubber hose leading to the primary valve, and brought the wrench down with bone-jarring force. The valve shattered. High-pressure hydraulic fluid sprayed into the air in a fine, foul-smelling mist. Outside, a deep, mechanical groan reverberated through the ground. The massive steel sluice gate that blocked the storm drain leading into the heart of the salvage yard began to slide downward, its counterweights no longer holding it in place. It slammed into the mud with a concussive thud, leaving a dark, gaping tunnel wide open. "We're in," Tomas said into his radio. "Execute." The infiltration didn't stay quiet for long. They made it 200 yards into the labyrinth of shipping containers and scrap piles before Sullivan's men realized the perimeter was breached. The first gunshot was deafening, a high-powered rifle round that struck a container 2 feet from Gwen's head, showering her in rust and orange paint chips. "Down!" Roman roared, grabbing her by the vest and throwing her behind the rusted tread of a defunct bulldozer. The yard erupted into chaos. Gunfire echoed off the steel hulls, creating a disorienting, overlapping cacophony of violence. Roman didn't stay pinned. He moved with a brutal, calculated aggression, returning fire with his Sig Sauer, dropping 2 men who tried to flank them from an elevated walkway. "Keep your head down," Roman ordered, slamming a fresh magazine into his pistol. "Do not move from this tread." He rolled out from cover, moving toward the center of the yard where a massive 4-story scrap crane loomed over the mud. Thomas and the rest of the crew pushed forward, pushing Sullivan's men back into a choke point. Gwen stayed low, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched Roman move. He was a force of nature, completely devoid of fear. But as he pushed past a stack of crushed cars, a heavy steel door on a nearby freighter swung open. 3 men stepped out, carrying automatic shotguns. They had Roman dead to rights, completely bypassing his cover. Gwen didn't think. She looked up. Directly above the 3 men was the massive magnetic disc of the scrap crane, suspended by a thick, braided steel cable. The crane's control cabin was only 20 feet away from her, accessible by a rusted yellow ladder. She dropped her bolt cutters and ran. A bullet clipped the dirt at her heels, but the shooters were too focused on Roman. Gwen hit the ladder and climbed, her boots slipping on the wet rungs. She hauled herself into the glass-enclosed cabin. It smelled of old sweat and stale cigarette smoke. The control panel was ancient. Twin joysticks, a power throttle, and an array of heavy toggle switches. Gwen had operated logging cranes and boat lifts for a decade. Machinery was machinery. She slammed the main power throttle forward. The diesel generator in the back of the crane roared to life, vibrating the entire cabin. Down in the mud, the 3 men turned, startled by the sudden roar of the engine. Roman, bleeding from a fresh graze on his shoulder, dove behind a concrete pylon as they opened fire. Gwen grabbed the right joystick and slammed it forward, releasing the mechanical brake on the winch drum. The 5-ton electromagnetic disc dropped in a freefall. It didn't hit the men. It didn't need to. It slammed into the top of the crushed cars right next to them with the force of a meteor strike. The shockwave of displaced mud, flying steel and concussive force threw all 3 men off their feet, burying them under an avalanche of jagged scrap metal. Silence fell over that corner of the yard. Gwen sat in the cabin, her hands trembling on the joysticks, breathing heavily. She looked down through the rain-streaked glass. Roman was standing slowly, his gun lowered. He looked at the crushed cars, then slowly raised his head to look at the crane cabin. Even through the rain and the glass, she could see the look on his face. It wasn't shock. It was absolute, undeniable reverence. 5 minutes later, a single gunshot rang out from the main office trailer at the far end of the yard. Thomas's voice crackled over the radio in the crane cabin. "Target secure. Sullivan Vane is dead. The yard is ours. The city was quiet at 3 a.m. They were back in the penthouse. The smell of gun smoke and wet rust had been scrubbed away by hot water and expensive soap. But the heavy weight of the day still hung in the air. Roman was sitting on the edge of the leather sofa in the main living room. He had taken his shirt off again, letting Dr. Arris check the fresh stitches on his shoulder and rewrap his bruised ribs. He drank a glass of neat scotch, staring at the floor. Gwen stood by the window, wearing a clean, oversized grey sweater and her dark jeans. She watched the city lights flicker below. She had killed today. Not directly, perhaps, but she had dropped 5 tons of steel to crush human beings, and she hadn't lost a second of sleep over it. The realization scared her less than it should have. Dr. Arris packed his bag, nodded to Roman, and quietly let himself out of the apartment. They were alone. Roman stood up slowly, the muscles in his back tense, as he walked over to a heavy oak desk in the corner. He unlocked a drawer, pulled out a thick, black leather briefcase, and walked over to Gwen. He set it on the glass table between them. "There's $250,000 in there," Roman said, his voice quiet, devoid of the harsh edge it carried during the day. "Clean bills, untraceable. It's more than enough to buy a new plot of land on the coast, build a new house, better tools, a bigger dock." Gwen looked at the briefcase. She didn't reach for it. "You keep your promises," she said softly. "I always keep my promises," Roman replied. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating off his battered skin. "Sullivan's crew is scattered. The ones who survived are running. No one will come looking for you. You are completely free, Gwen." Gwen looked away from the money and up into his eyes. "My house is ash," Gwen said, her voice steady. "My tools are melted. The coast is just cold water and empty fog now." "You can rebuild," Roman said, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes were searching her face, looking for the crack, looking for the moment she would break and take the money and run back to her quiet life. "I don't want to rebuild," Gwen said. She stepped around the glass table, closing the distance between them. She reached out, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the fresh bandage on his shoulder. "If I go back there, I'm just a mechanic hiding from the world. If I stay here—" "If you stay here," Roman interrupted, his voice dropping to a low, rough whisper, "you will never have peace again. I live in the dark, Gwen. Every day is a war. Every shadow is a threat. You saw what this life is." "I saw a man bleeding out in a sinking plane who didn't panic," Gwen countered, her chin tilting up to meet his gaze. "I saw a man who burned a city block down to protect what was his. And I saw a man who looked at me like I actually belonged there." Roman's breath hitched, a ragged sound that had nothing to do with his injured ribs. "I drag things out of the wreckage, Roman," Gwen whispered, her hand moving from his shoulder to cup his rough, stubbled jaw. "It's what I do, and I'm not leaving you to sink." Roman didn't argue anymore. He couldn't. He dropped his head, closing the last fraction of an inch between them, and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was heavy, desperate, and tasted of scotch and violence. It was the kiss of a man who had been drowning his entire life, and had finally, miraculously, found solid ground. Gwen kissed him back, her hands gripping the hard muscle of his arms, anchoring him to the room. She didn't need the quiet of the coast anymore. She had found the storm, and for the first time in her life, she was exactly where she belonged. The engine of their lives kept turning, fueled by iron, blood, and an unbreakable bond forged in the wreckage. Gwen traded the cold coast for a darker ocean, standing beside the man she pulled from the tide. If this gritty journey of survival and devotion hooked you, don't let the story end here. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a truly grounded Mafia romance, and make sure to subscribe to the channel.